cool.
Do that all again.
Hi. This is they're doing intro to Bitcoins or distributed cryptocurrencies for fun and profit. Here we go. So what is Bitcoin? We start with the basics. This is what Bitcoin.org claims in their blurb. I'm not going to read it because that would be boring. Let's just go through it real quickly though. It's a digital currency, so that means you don't have paper Bitcoins, you can't put them in your pocket. I think everyone sort of realizes that's the idea. It enables instant payments to anyone, anywhere on the planet. And the instant part is maybe not quite true, but it's really quick. So you can send someone in China money within 20 minutes, and no banks are involved, which is pretty far out. It uses peer-to-peer technology, so there's no central Bitcoin server. Everyone's just participating in the same way that BitTorrent works, or LimeWire, those sorts of things. It's all, everyone's an equal sort of in the network. And because of that, there's no central authority. There's no way to shut down Bitcoins just by taking down a company and having it go away. And finally, it's also a piece of software which you use to work with Bitcoins. Bitcoin is in a client. So why should you care about this? I know some of you already do care about it a lot, but if you have no idea what's happening, there's, in my opinion, 3 real big reasons. Feel free to shout at any other ones that you think are really important. But there's a potential for investment right now because Bitcoin serves a role similar to that of gold, that gold traditionally serves, and that it's a hedge against inflation. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins in existence, and therefore nobody can arbitrarily create more Bitcoins and therefore make all the other ones worth less. So that's neat. In practice, it's still extremely volatile because it's new, so you should only ever throw money that you're okay risking at it. There's an emerging sort of derivatives world forming around Bitcoins that enables people to do futures contracts, options trading, that sort of stuff, which would really help with the volatility. But that's all sort of advanced and kind of beyond the scope of what I'm going to get into. Next up, Bitcoin I kind of hate this term, but it is pretty true here, is a disruptive technology. It's a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot, but Bitcoin, everybody uses money. Everyone plays the game of how do I get things from you without trying to find the chickens you want, right? So I have money and I give it to you. And Bitcoin kind of blows up how that game is played today, or it could. And it's still very new, so there's a lot of opportunity to build services around it and tools around it and businesses around it that can reach a lot of people and change the world and make you a lot of money, which would be nice. And then I know from the kind of talk before that some people here are going to be interested in the last point, which is politics or philosophy, which is Bitcoin enables sort of a new world of money. It competes directly with central banks, and yet it's sort of the decentral bank. It doesn't exist anywhere. There's nowhere you can point to and say that person's making Bitcoin policy. No one's setting the Bitcoin interest rate. And so it sort of theoretically frees people from dealing with this central banking institution tradition, which arguably has caused a lot of problems. And so you will often find people that consider themselves libertarians or anarcho-capitalists associated with the Bitcoin movement. However, I wouldn't say that's actually the majority of people. It's definitely a very vocal minority that kind of guides the character of the project, but most people just think it's cool. There's a lot of people that are just nerds, read some cypherpunk books in the 80s and are like, oh, cool, digital currency, I love it. So why shouldn't you officially care about Bitcoins? Officially, you should not use Bitcoins to support WikiLeaks. They accept Bitcoins. They were one of the first large organizations to do so, and they did it to get around restrictions that credit card companies had placed upon them, sort of because of their questionable legal standing. So they weren't able to get money through traditional means, so they opened up Bitcoin donations and were able to survive off of that. And now they can take real money again. Drugs. Absolutely do not go on the internet. Don't set up Tor. Don't find Silk Road, and don't use it to buy drugs. That's a bad idea.
Not at all effective.
It's no, it's a bad idea because it's extremely effective, and you're leading to the degeneration of society. So there was exactly none of this global corporatization of the drug industry. Buy local, keep it organic marijuana only. So seriously though, there was a big hoopla around the Silk Road, which is a site that exists on the Tor network, which I'll talk about in a second. But it effectively it's like eBay for drugs. It's like, I want some heroin. I have bitcoins and an address to ship to that I'm reasonably comfortable doing so, and you can go out and purchase illegal drugs. Gambling is illegal in most jurisdictions, and you should absolutely not participate in any sort of gambling using bitcoins because that would be very bad of you. But it is quite popular. There's a company called Satoshi Dice, which actually is the source of the lion's share of transactions on the Bitcoin network, and it's effectively automated roulette, without nearly as many cool, weird side bets you make. You basically put bitcoins in, and you have a fixed % chance of getting some multiple out. And they have actually made a shit ton of money. In December, they're traded on a public exchange of securities that are traded in Bitcoin, so it's not super popular yet. But they started posting earnings because of this. In December, they earned, at the time, was around $230,000 in profit. Bitcoin has gone up recently. Today, it'd be worth around $750,000 in profit in a month for a company that's been around for around a year. It's not bad.
They're in?
Sorry?
Do you know what country they're in?
They're in Ireland. Actually, it's funny. They were the guy that created it. It was too successful, and he's like, I'm worried that this is going to get me in jail. So he went on Reddit, and he's like, who wants to buy my gambling site? And I think it's the first company that was ever sold over Reddit, which is pretty cool. And then money laundering, this one maybe actually don't do because it's kind of a dick move. But it's something that people are worried about with Bitcoin's enabling money laundering. And it's true. It's possible, but in the same way, cash enables all these things too, and that's sort of where the basis I'm going to work from.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay if you have a quick one.
So, is Bitcoin anonymous? I mean,
I'm going
you
to.
still need Tor. You're saying you need Tor.
Yeah, I'm going to cover the anonymous elements of Bitcoin in a second. So Tor, yeah, like I said, if you're going to do any of these, you need to look into Tor, and I'll go into that in more depth in a little bit. So first, though, how do you get Bitcoins? Because you can't find them on the sidewalk because they don't exist in the real world. And, I don't know anyone that's going to pay me in them. Except, I guess, who was it? Just started?
BitInstant.
I don't know. This is the Internet Archive?
Internet Archive.
Yeah. Apparently, the Internet Archive just started offering to pay its employees in Bitcoin. But there's 3 major ways to get them. And then also nice friends. So if any of you guys are feeling particularly nice after this. No. But exchanges are effectively... They're not quite banks, but they let you take dollars or any other fiat currency and convert them to bitcoins or go back. They're straightforward to use. You can do it all from your computer. It requires you to give them your personal information and your banking. They ask for your documents, and you have to set up a bank account. So if you are thinking about doing some very naughty things, this might not be the way to go because your name and identity will be attached. It also takes about 4 days to get all that set up and to clear all the sort of regulatory hurdles. So if you want to buy them tomorrow and you don't have an account, it's not going to help you. The next way, which is kind of, I like it the most because it makes you feel like a spy, right? And who doesn't like to do that, is what's called over-the-counter, which is basically I go to Starbucks, some other guy goes to Starbucks, I hand him a envelope of cash, and he sends me some bitcoins. It's all very clandestine. But there's a bunch of really good sites, Local Bitcoins, and a bunch of other ones out there that help find people who are willing to buy or sell bitcoins in person for cash, or PayPal or something like that. Although, again, depending on what you're doing with them, stick with cash. And the key is that these services provide sort of reputation mechanisms. Because anytime you tell someone, yeah, I'll meet you at the coffee shop with $10,000, it's a good way to get mugged. It's like if someone knows where you're going with a lot of money, bad things can happen. So it's good because you have people that have done this a lot of times. You can sort of view their history and know that they're trustworthy people, and that's something to be cognizant of if you're ever going to go out and meet someone. The last one is mining, which I'm going to go into in a bit here. Oh, and nice friends. If you have a question?
So I've heard that you can do it with buying gift cards or something like that.
That's sort of the other way. That's going from Bitcoins to cash or Amazon or something. And I'll cover that.
Well, there's the MoneyGrams. That you can do MoneyGrams through BitInstant. So that's a very popular way to get Bitcoins, actually, where you go into 7-Eleven with a MoneyGram and you pay with US dollars for your MoneyGram, and then you deposit it. It ends up in a Bitcoin address. I haven't personally done it, but BitInstant is a very popular way to do that.
Okay. So yeah,
It's along the same lines.
MoneyGrams through BitInstant. And I know there's also people are setting up kind of what they're calling reverse ATMs, which is where you take your cash and you put it into the machine and like specify a Bitcoin address and it just sends it.
Yeah, they debuted those at the Liberty Forum in New Hampshire this last month.
Yeah, there's a bunch on the East Coast, and I know there are a couple out here too, but I don't know where they are yet. So before we get to mining, what happens when you what does it mean to get Bitcoins? Bitcoin addresses are cryptographic strings or cryptographically secure strings, which look something like this. It's just a bunch of bullshit. But you don't have to worry about it. Don't have to try to memorize it. It would be managed by a Bitcoin client in the same way that you'd use a browser to get on the internet. And it's stored in a wallet on your computer, which is basically just a file. It's an important point, though, because that's where the Bitcoins are. They're like cash. Nobody else has them. Nobody else has a backup. If you don't back up your Bitcoins and your hard drive dies, you lose all your Bitcoins. So if you have Bitcoins on your computer, make copies. Put them in a safe somewhere. Yeah.
If someone loses their Bitcoins in that way, do they go out of circulation?
Yes, and I'll talk about that a bit later on.
Is Bitcoin address and Bitcoin the same thing?
No. So Bitcoin address it's like an email address almost, and Bitcoins are like messages. So this is where you send Bitcoins, and then if I was going to pay you, you would give me this string of yours, and then I would be able to use that to send you Bitcoins, and your client could tell you how many Bitcoins are associated with this address.
It's like your own wallet in that case, right? So,
Yeah, it's like if you think of somehow this string of characters becomes a leather wallet, that's a reasonable way to sort of get an intuition for it. You can put money in it, you can take money out of it. And we'll talk about how that, at the end of the last section I'm going to go into a technical sort of overview of how transactions and everything actually works, and maybe it'll be clear then how this all works. So the third form of getting Bitcoins is mining, and it's a pretty fascinating subject. I'm just going to give you a sort of strategic overview right now. So what does it mean to mine a digital currency? Like if you mine gold, it's because you dig it up and then you smelt it, and now you have gold in your hand, and that's obvious how it works, right? So what does it mean to mine a digital currency? Transactions in the Bitcoin network depend on the network as a whole performing computationally difficult problems, solving difficult problems. So each time one of those solutions is found, the person that figures it out gets a reward. In this case, right now it's 25 Bitcoins. And that's sort of the incentive for the network to keep processing transactions.
A solution to what?
It's basically it's what's called a proof of work problem. It's a problem that is hard for a computer to solve. Okay, and so it basically takes a lot of time and effort for it to actually to find a correct solution to the problem. But it's very easy to check if a solution is correct. Okay, so basically what happens is transactions get agglomerated into these blocks of transactions, and each one kind of gets signed off on. And that signing off part is the hard problem you're solving. And the specific mechanics of it, again, I'll get the technical nitty-gritty of it at the end, but that's sort of what makes the whole thing move around. And so mining is basically just trying to solve those problems. And the way it works is that the more compute power there is trying to solve it, the harder the problems get. And so if you control a certain percentage of the total network, then that's the percentage chance you have of effectively solving one of these problems and getting the reward. And so the basis of mining is that you get together a bunch of computational power and you throw it at this, you put it as part of the network and have it start working on processing transactions. And then if you are sort of lucky or have just a tremendous amount of power, you'll start getting Bitcoins back.
Questions?
Yeah.
So if, is everyone trying to solve, can multiple people try to solve the same block at once?
Yes.
And then one person gets it and my time disappears because I didn't solve it?
Yes. So exactly, you don't accrue credit. It's all statistical. So if everyone works on the same next block at the same time, and then when that block is solved, everyone starts working on the one after that. But everyone's working on the same problem at the same time,
Oh.
and it's the first person to solve it gets the
There's
bounty.
no offline mining whatsoever.
Effectively, no. I mean, you need to be part of the network for it to
You
work.
have to have the address. If they want, like the string, every participant should have an address to be able to mine. Is that what you're saying?
Ultimately, yes. The addresses, the client just generates them. They're effectively free. They don't. You can generate as many of them as you want. They're sort of a. They're not a main really element of the architecture, but yes, you would be mining with an address, and then if you solve a block as part of that, you indicate that this is where you send the reward, and then once everyone sees that you're correct, they agree with you, and it goes to you. And so, because it's all based on computational sort of effort, people have been working. Originally, it started out, people were the first 5-10 people working on Bitcoin were, just running it on their local machines and using their processor to solve these problems, and that worked fine. And then it got a little bigger, and people realized they could harness their graphics cards and get a lot more out of that, so they did, and that became more competitive. And recently, we've seen the development of FPGA, which is field. I always forget what the F means. Field programmable gate arrays, which is effectively reprogrammable hardware. Is kind of the simple way to put it. And then ASIC chips, which stands for application specific integrated circuit, and that's when you take the logic for a piece of software and actually turn it into a piece of silicon. So you actually take the algorithm and burn it directly onto a chip. And so it runs much faster and much more efficiently. And those are just rolling out now. So we're seeing this transition from hobbyists sort of working with GPUs to people with industrial level capabilities, basically an order or two, like 2 orders of magnitude or more faster and more efficient, sort of entering the marketplace.
Anybody tried to use Hadoop job, MapReduce to do those sort of stuff?
Yeah, you can. I wouldn't. I mean, you can't use Hadoop just because I wouldn't use Hadoop because of the architecture of Hadoop. But even if you were to use it, it really does just scale with hardware. So
there is no logical mathematical way of parallelizing.
It's extremely parallelizable. It's just that the throughput of the cost of running a Hadoop cluster that was competitive in terms of throughput just would be enormous. The advantages here are due to specialization. So the new hardware is extremely specialized to compute the hashes that are necessary, and it gains tremendous advantage because of that. So because of that, it's very unlikely if you go, set up your computer at home, your laptop or your desktop, and you just have it running, it's extremely unlikely that you will actually win a block ever, or any time in the near future. It's basically like playing the lottery, and it's going to cost you electricity in the long run.
The fact that everybody's working on the same block at the same time, does that not mean that whoever mines fastest wins all blocks?
No, it does not. It means they have so the question was, if everyone's working on the same block at the same time, whoever works fastest wins. It's not the case because it's not a progressive workload. It's a statistical workload. So it's you don't go from here and deduce a solution. You basically guess.
You have to be lucky.
you guess at solutions and check if they're right. And basically, the more computation you have, the faster you can guess. But someone else can get lucky with less computation.
So it's like a keylogger. Sorry, not a keylogger, but like brute force trying to guess
Yes,
the password.
it's like cracking passwords. That's actually a very good analogy. So even if you don't have fancy hardware, mining pools offer a way to participate in mining if you care to. It's basically where a bunch of people get together, all combine their effort, and then whenever someone in the pool finds a solution and gets the reward, it gets distributed throughout the pool based on how much work you put in. And
How is that different to just...
well, so if I have a 0.001 chance of finding a block on my own, statistically, if you multiply the chance by the reward, it's worth some amount of money to me, but it's probably not going to happen. So this is sort of, instead of getting like a 25 Bitcoin reward is worth a little over $1,000 right now. So you have a 0.001 chance of getting $1,000, or you have a 100% chance, or a high chance of getting, $5.
And
Right.
you have the cost of computational power and
Yeah.
electricity.
Yeah. So if you're running it, it's going to drive up your electricity bill, and so it's basically a hedge against uncertainty. Yep. And then the pools will usually operate with some fee, where the maintainers will take about 3%. I think is the sort of standard. So now that you have some Bitcoins, even if you went through the arduous process of mining them, how can you actually use them without feeling like a criminal? Bitmit.net is pretty cool. It's kind of like eBay, where you can pay in Bitcoins, but you can't buy drugs. So it's like there's sort of three eBays floating around. There's real eBay, there's Silk Road, and there's Bitmit. You can, as of recently, buy Reddit Gold, which is I'm actually not a huge Redditor, so I don't know exactly how it works. But it's basically their sort of premium service, which you can gift to people, and you can buy that with Bitcoin. I think Mega Upload actually is accepting Bitcoin too. There's a bunch of tech services like hosting. You can run a website entirely with Bitcoin. And then locally, we were talking about, there's a cupcake joint up in San Fran where you can go in and buy a dozen cupcakes with Bitcoins. And apparently they're really good.
Amazing.
Yeah. And I've heard there's a place called 20 Mission. 20 Mission, which is it's a hacker house, but it's focused on, it's basically a startup house where you can live there and have space and work on stuff, but apparently they accept Bitcoins for rent and utilities and stuff. And then I believe Loredana was asking before, you can also, there's services which will change your Bitcoins into gift cards, into prepaid cards. So if you want to have like a Visa debit card, you can pay Bitcoins and get a debit card and use it just like any other debit card, but it's a preloaded thing. Or you can get an Amazon certificate where you can, so if you want to buy a book with Bitcoins, but Amazon doesn't accept Bitcoins, you can easily convert it to an Amazon gift card, for example. There's a huge list of things you can do with Bitcoins on the Bitcoin wiki under trade. I'm going to have a list of resources like this. If anyone's interested afterwards, just shoot me your email and I'll send it out on the meetup thread as well. So, it's something very important to understand. Bitcoins are not an anonymous currency. Okay? Every transaction made in the Bitcoin network is entirely public. Everyone can see it. They can see the amount, they can see where it came from, and where it went to. The reason you can gain anonymity is because those transactions are not tied to you. They're tied to one of those long alphanumeric strings. It's a Bitcoin address. So as long as an address is not connected to you, then all anyone ever knows is that Bitcoins went from here to here, right? So the key, if you do want to do something which requires anonymity, like helping Iranian protesters without getting on the CIA watch list or Mossad watch list or whatever Ahmadinejad has, right? This is sort of the rough structure you're probably going to want to follow. And again, I know there's people here who have some knowledge, so if I'm missing anything, do shout it out. But first, the only way that you're going to be compromised is if someone can tie either the one end or the other of a transaction to you in real life. So if you buy your Bitcoins cash over the counter anonymously, and the guy's not a spook, that covers one end. Nobody knows where it came from. If you do buy them from Mt. Gox or something, there are ways to deal with it, but it's more involved. Next, never, ever, ever, ever reuse a wallet address if it's something that's sensitive. So wallet addresses, again, are those long sort of alphanumeric characters. They're free. The Bitcoin client can generate as many of them as you want immediately, and you don't we're never going to run out of them. There's just way too many. So always use a new address if it's anything remotely sensitive. Always use Tor. Sorry, you have a question?
When you have to so Bitcoins have to be in a wallet, which is one of those addresses.
Yep.
If I want to switch to a new wallet, that wallet's empty.
So yeah, let me explain. So basically, if I were going to go out and buy Bitcoins, I would first create a new address immediately before going out, and have that be where they send it to. Okay. Right. So if we meet at Starbucks and I give you $1,000, I'm like, here, send it to this new address I just made, right? And on top of that, if I'm on my laptop at Starbucks, I need to be using Tor. Tor stands for the Onion Router. It's a neat piece of software which sort of lets you anonymously browse the internet. It's the specifics of how it works are beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about. But if you are interested in this, first of all, you need to research everything yourself and understand it, because be as paranoid as possible. But Tor's a little tricky, but it's not too hard to get the hang of. Yeah.
You will note about the Tor network. Apparently, somebody told me that about 30% of Tor nodes are now controlled either by CIA or some other. So you might not be as anonymous as you think. So I don't know if you have any updates on that.
So it's definitely it's definitely a known vulnerability of Tor where you can have compromised nodes. And at certain levels, 30% would be a lot. It's plausible, but it doesn't necessarily compromise the anonymity. It compromises the content. So Tor information is transmitted encrypted over so basically my connection to another Tor node is encrypted, but the content I send may not be. And if you have a compromised Tor node between me and my final destination, then you can read my communication if you compromise a Tor node, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can prove who I am.
Well, the only way you can prove is if you're connecting to the compromised node. First node is compromised.
To prove who I am, you need to control both the entrance and exit nodes, I believe, because
as long as you're connected to the entrance node, I think they will see it.
Well, we can go into it later, but as I understand it, even if there are compromised internal nodes, it still gives you plausible deniability at worst. So worst case, I mean, it's still better than using just the regular internet. Use a Tumblr or e-wallet service. That's basically where you take a bunch of your coins, you throw them into a pool with a bunch of other people, and then they get sent back to some other address. Again, you don't want to send them back to yourself, but so you create another address, throw them up, and then the similar amount with a slight processing fee will be sent back to another address. The point is that if you mix all these coins together, you sort of lose the thread. It's almost impossible, if done correctly, to follow transactions through one of these pools in a certain way. You can do things statistically, but
When you use a client to create an address, is that somehow tied to, I don't know, your IP address? Does it have any information about who you are?
it theoretically could be. I mean, so that's why anytime you're going to do anything sketchy, and I don't want to spend too much time on the sketchy parts of Bitcoin, but anytime you're going to do something that you want to have anonymity for, it's important if any networking should be done over Tor, and ideally you should have a computer that you use only for this, right? So that way, if you need to, you can get rid of it, and, well, my laptop's fine. Yeah, it's on here. One more?
Would you also need to get a Wi-Fi connection that's exclusively for that exclusive laptop?
That's you should plug it in with a wire.
Sure.
But that's why Tor is there. So, assuming you're running Tor, then any of your network traffic, unless the CIA gets you apparently, should be okay. this is a kind of a silly one, but make sure the numbers don't line up. If you want to give 10 bitcoins to Iranian protesters, buy 15, spend 5 on Satoshi Dice, and donate the rest. Because numbers that match are easier to track through other, even if you try to obscure it in other means. And then finally, encrypt all communications using something like PGP or GPG. So even if you are using Tor, if you're communicating with someone especially, always encrypt it, because this is correct. If someone has a compromised node inside of Tor, for example, even if you're anonymous, if you're sending an email with your name on it, you're boned, because it has your name on it. But if it's encrypted, that's the idea is that nobody can read it. So cool. Now that we kind of understand how Bitcoin can be procured, what they might be used for, why they might be interesting, what's sort of holding it back? What might be some problems in the future? There's a couple of major categories. I'm going to start off with what I call the civilized threats, meaning that they don't involve people being too sneaky or nasty. They mostly come from government. First up, we have policy threats. So, things like money laundering, drug dealing, terrorism, all those are illegal, and they're all things that people think Bitcoins are good for, right? And it sort of there's a parallel argument almost with gun control, where you'll have a mass shooting and people will say, well, we need more gun control. But the gun rights advocates is like, well, the guns he had, if the laws were properly enforced, would have been illegal already, right? And so you have this weird tension. And if you're going to go one way or the other, ultimately you need to accept sort of that some people are going to do bad things with this tool, or you need to ban it, right? So in the same way, if you were to ban guns, what's the catchy phrase they have?
Only criminals will have guns.
Yeah, if guns are illegal, only criminals will have guns, right?
We don't need gun control, we need bullet control.
So the point is, if you outlaw the currency, I don't think that would be enough to stop it, actually. I think it would be able to operate just fine as a black market currency and only criminals would use it. Or people... Criminals here is loosely defined. It's not necessarily Vinny the mook, who's going to break your kneecaps. It's somebody who doesn't want to pay taxes on something. It'll move. Moving it underground doesn't kill it. What might kill it is a great firewall, sort of thing like China does with the internet. Because if you are able, it wouldn't kill it technically. People would find ways to work around it. But if it becomes just too fucking difficult to use Bitcoins, then not enough people to participate, and perhaps it falls
You can
apart.
use rootkits.
Yeah.
You make your cell phone just not deal with Bitcoin at all.
Yes,
Not touch the Bitcoin protocol.
Yeah, you could have a massive regulatory structure, but even then you could have stenographic techniques. But again, it gets really complicated, and maybe I'm gonna do it because I have a beard and I'm a nerd. But most people I know are like, I don't care anymore. I'm just gonna use dollars. That's fine. But I don't think it's a huge threat, because to really lock it down enough to kill it, you're gonna lose so much else.
And because we have bearded nerds.
Exactly. Besides that, there's sort of propaganda efforts, so it's pretty easy to spread FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You can try to talk a lot about the money laundering, drug dealing, terrorist parts of Bitcoin, and make people scared. And I don't think that's going to be particularly effective. What is another expression? Money talk something. I don't know. The point is, when money is concerned, people are going to use it if it's to the benefit, even if people are saying shit about it. Outside of that, depending on how paranoid you are and how much of a gold bug you are, you may or may not believe that the federal part of the executive branch has been manipulating the gold and silver markets. It's probably just because you're mad that you got in late and didn't make any money. But it's possible that people with the tremendous, financial backing of government could step in and try to manipulate the price of Bitcoins and actually keep them from taking off that way. But again, that'd be a short-term attack. I don't think you could hold it down permanently that way. And so I'm gonna hand wave on a lot of the government of these threats, because basically, if the government really, 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 really wants to shut it down and they're willing to do really terrible things to people, then fine. But then you have bigger problems than Bitcoin not working.
What about hacker theft? I didn't see that there.
I'm getting to that. So I was trying to talk about policy issues there. There's the two more slides of threats. There's some issues. The next one, and this would actually probably fall into this boat, but sort of falls into technical. There's some economic objections to Bitcoin. There's a limited supply of them. there will only ever be, at most, 21 million Bitcoins in existence. That's fixed based on the software, which, again, we'll get into the technical bits right after this. But it's sort of, there's a curve of 0 to more, and then it slows down and sort of asymptotes at 21 million. So, fortunately, you can subdivide Bitcoins to 8 decimal places. So it ends up being 21 quadrillion units, which is a lot. If you need more than that, there's also ways to address it, but that's far in the future. On top of that, if my hard drive crashes and I didn't back it up because I'm lazy, and I had Bitcoins on there, those Bitcoins are now gone forever. There's no way to tell if Bitcoins have been lost or if someone just isn't spending them, right? And the only place they exist is in this file on your computer unless you make copies. So make copies. But if Bitcoins are lost, they're gone forever. Again, though, since they're valuable and people tend to be somewhat capable of looking after themselves, you're not gonna lose more than half of the Bitcoins in existence this way. And if you up to that point, I think the limited supply argument, until you get to an order of magnitude less, the limited supply thing is basically the same case. Finally, there's concern around what's called a deflationary spiral. Mike, you know economics better than I do. I'm going to try to explain this. If I mess it up, jump in. I'm going to make some assumptions about how currency works real fast. So, deflation is the opposite of inflation. Inflation happens when my dollars become worth less in terms of real things, so I can't buy as much. So gas gets more expensive, food gets more expensive, in numeric terms, right? But eventually I'll make more and it'll all balance out, is the idea. Deflation is the opposite. So if I have $100 in a deflationary environment, in a week it'll buy $120 worth of stuff based on a week ago. Make sense? So the interesting problem there is when you have a currency like the dollar, it's actually a debt instrument. If you look on your dollar bills, it says Federal Reserve Note, right? And the note part is important because it basically means the holder of this piece of paper is entitled to repayment on something. It's kind of vague on what you're going to get, but it turns out it's dollars, and it's a weird circular thing. But so the interesting problem is that combined with fractional reserve banking, which is what basically, if you give a bank $1, they can lend out 9 more. So it's a neat trick. That's how they make a lot of money, both literally and figuratively. The problem is, so if in a deflationary environment, what ends up happening, let's see if I can remember this, is basically debts don't get repaid. No. Mike, how's it work?
Oh wow! Now you put me on. I'm not giving a
Okay,
talk
fine.
today.
I'm gonna skip over the mechanism because I'm forgetting it at the moment. But
It happened in
effectively,
Japan in like 2001.
and the Great Depression was sort of an example of it theoretically. But the idea is basically, as deposits diminish, this fractional reserve
As the
mechanism
money
operates
is really
in reverse.
valuable. Money becomes more valuable. People want more money. They pull more money out. As
That's
they
it.
pull
Sorry,
more
yes,
money out,
thank
the
you.
money supply gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller because you don't have that multiplier effect from fractional reserve banking. So money becomes even more valuable.
Yep.
And people pull more of it out.
And the point is, when you pull money out, it undoes this fractional reserve thing. So if I put $100 in the bank and they can lend out 900 above that, but I pull out 50, all of a sudden they got to make up another $450. Right? So when money becomes more valuable and I'm pulling it out of the banking system, it actually reduces the money supply, which then, since the money supply reduces, makes it more valuable and just incentivizes. It creates a sort of feedback loop.
Holy shit, it's like time travel.
It is. So the thing about Bitcoins, though, is that they're not a debt instrument, and they're not used in any fractional reserve scheme right now. And so a deflationary environment would not cause, again, in my opinion and the Austrian economists' opinions, would not cause this feedback loop. It just, it as an asset would appreciate relative to other assets, but there wouldn't be this sort of accelerating panic.
So you're saying nobody's lending bitcoins at this point?
There's some lending, but it's not fractional reserve. So it's not that I have actually 10 bitcoins, but can pretend I have 100. Right?
Oh, okay, you cannot lend what you don't have.
Right.
Yeah, there could be an organization that comes around and decides to start lending bitcoins that just happens to have a shit ton of bitcoins that they want to lend out based on some interest model. It's totally possible.
And that would be fine, especially because if they were to do so if they do it the way that the Federal Reserve and banks do it now, it's fraud, like because they're not telling you. But they have a special legal exemption. So if they were going to do it, they would have to actually inform people like, hey, you can only get 10% out at a time. Like we have these controls. You're gonna there's some risk, etc. And I think that's okay. It's because it more accurately represents. It's a more accurate investment vehicle. There's another question here.
Would you say that the risk for the deflationary spiral to bitcoins is somewhat offset by the fact that they're alternative currencies? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so there are essentially one of the next things. Litecoin is another alternative cryptocurrency. You can use things like gold could be considered a currency, national currencies. Yeah, it would definitely it acts more like an asset,
Right.
and floats against other assets, as opposed to a backed currency or currency that's backed by government and has weird properties by law. And that's ultimately my point. And I'm not a PhD. I don't have a PhD in economics, so I'm going to sort of hand wave here a little bit and say this is sort of according to people I've read who've thought about it. And I'll provide some more links to papers on this stuff in the resources sort of email that I'll send out or attach to this deck or whatever. But sort of it's the deflationary spiral effect seems to be tied very closely to the nature of the currency it's affecting, and that seems to require sort of a fiat landscape.
Maybe just a little comment. So what you're saying is it's not possible to lend out more bitcoins because of the infrastructure. Nobody can print.
Yeah, nobody can just pretend there's more bitcoins
Right.
without telling you they're pretending.
Right, because they actually have to solve those hashes to have those bitcoins free to borrow.
Yeah, effectively.
So infrastructurally, it's not possible to print bitcoin.
And so ultimately, I don't think this is actually a big problem at all. Alternate cryptocurrencies exist. Litecoin is a very similar to Bitcoin. It's not nearly as popular. It has a couple of different features. Worst case, it overtakes Bitcoin and wins, and then we still have a distributed cryptocurrency. So I don't fine. Bitcoin can die in a fire. I don't care as long as something's there. That's not a threat. It's just branding.
Can they merge?
It's complicated.
Open source.
Finally, there's some technical threats. There's the somewhat now infamous 51% attack, which is if I control more than half of the total compute power of the network, I can reasonably do bad things. Fortunately, it's not that bad. The bad things I can do are limited. I can basically pretend to spend money, convince you I actually gave it to you, turn off my attack, and have it revert to me. That's sort of the nature of the attack. It's costly to sustain because there's just so much computational throughput. The electricity cost alone to sustain the attack on an ongoing basis would be tremendous. And again, the network will recover to a normal operating state after an attack ends. It's also extremely unlikely that this would even be possible at any time in the near future. There was a point in time where it was possible, where a concerted effort could have been made, but as industrial mining concerns get going and accumulate more and more computational throughput, putting together a 5 petahash system, in 10 years, I don't know.
They're selling like a 15,000 gigahash system.
Yeah, I'm setting up a mining operation with my business partner. We're gonna have 4.5 terahashes. We project that by the time we receive the machines, the network throughput will be around 400 terahashes.
Because as they produce these machines that do that, more and more people buy them, more
Yeah.
consumers get involved, and then it just
So are they
exponentially
the
expands the
butterfly lab
computing
ones,
power.
Yes.
or- Okay.
And specifically, Butterfly Labs specifically, the way they're distributing the machines, they're trying to make sure that it goes out so it's not by chance one person doesn't get a ton of machines at once. And so I think assuming that we survive the next 6 months, a 51% attack is extremely unlikely. And I think the precautions are in place to survive the next 6 months. So I'm not
And the
particularly worried about
incentives
it.
are aligned so that if you had that
Yeah,
computing
that's-
power, you'd be better off not disrupting.
That's the last point. So I could either defraud someone for a couple $1,000, or I could just mine really hard and make 10 times more. There's really no reason, unless you're a sneaky, backstabbing sort of government agency. Like they're the only ones that might have an incentive, again, to spread uncertainty to do this. Economically, it just makes more sense to mine bitcoins than it does to try to defraud someone. Quantum computing breaks some of the cryptography in bitcoins. Fortunately, it's not an issue because bitcoins, the algorithm for actually signing things is not fixed. There's a little scripting language embedded in Bitcoin, and basically a transaction is completed by both ends of a script resolving to the same thing. And so there are actually known methods of cryptography which would survive in a quantum computing environment. They're just not as efficient, so they're not being used. But if it were apparent that quantum computing were going to be a thing, it'd be possible to change over. And quantum computing is still pretty far off. Like there's some neat results, but in terms of it being a generally available, general purpose thing, it's still a good way away. Finally, there may be flaws or bugs in the Bitcoin protocol. There are some known issues which could be vulnerabilities. There are steps being taken to mitigate them. None of them are game changing. There's a really good wiki article on the potential flaws, but for the most part, that's something that you can say about any software system is that there might be bugs in it.
The Reddit community really seems to find them and iron them out pretty quickly. It's kind of interesting. They'll announce there's an issue with a minimum size of the blocks that was just announced. Something there was a minimum of, or it was a maximum of 256. Something about the blocks being moved around, and they had to be 256K or something like that. It was on Reddit, and it's a conversation that's happening. That's why I'm kind of unclear on the details. But essentially, the agency that's responsible for the transaction needs to do a minor alteration to allow for larger blocks to pass through, because we've passed the point where a block is the small size.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, it was just this last week that I heard about it. So.
Far out. I know that blocks are limited to 1 megabyte, which might be. I don't think we're anywhere near.
Along the same lines, but
I don't think we're anywhere near hitting that limit though.
no, it's somewhere around half that.
So let's get technical. How does it all actually work? Like, how does a distributed cryptocurrency work? How can you actually trust it? Like, and I'm not gonna. Don't worry, there's no heavy math in here, or really much math at all. I'm just gonna explain sort of at a conceptual level how it all fits together. Before getting into it, there's sort of 3 things I kind of want to go through at a really high level. If I kind of like am too confusing, please shout out if you don't get these things, because they're really not that complicated, and I should be able to explain them. So the first idea is something called public key cryptography. Basically, all that is a way for you to send me encrypted messages. It's the same thing that banks use, secure websites use. And the way it works is I have 2 keys, 2 little pieces of information. One's a public key, one's a private key. I make the public key public, and using that, you can take some sort of document, encrypt it, send it to me, and I can use my private key to unencrypt it. But it doesn't work the other way. So you can't. Nobody else can use the public key to unencrypt it. Only I can see what the contents are. Does that make sense so far? Cool. Also, I can take a document, and using my private key, I can sign it, basically produce some additional information that verifies that I sort of signed off on this, put that out there, and using my public key, you can take it and the document and the extra bit and verify that I signed it. Make sense? Cool. Next up is hashing, which is another sort of interesting operation. But basically, if I have a bunch of data over here in my unencrypted space, a hash function is something that just takes it and converts it to a small, effectively string of letters and numbers. Think of it that way. Effectively just a number. It's in this case, we use SHA 256, so it's 256 bits of information. The key feature is that if I change one little piece of information over here, this number changes radically, right? So it's not, I can't tweak it here and then this changes a little bit. The idea is that it's not directly obvious what input created this little number. The neat thing is if I send you a file and you want to make sure it's the same one, you can do the same thing and check that these numbers match, and then we believe that, you know, the transfer happened fine. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. So the last part is what's called a proof of work function. And Bitcoin uses something that's based on the hash cache proof of work function. So remember this hash number that I was talking about? Basically, in the same way if you had 9,999 and you turn the first 9 into a 0, you have 999. It's a smaller number. The goal of this proof of work thing is to find a hash value that has enough zeros at the start. So basically a small enough number. So why is this difficult? Because it's very hard to construct a piece of data that produces a specific output. So what we do is if you have this piece of data, we add a little value called a nonce, which is a weird little name. But it's basically a small number. And in combination, you run this all through this to produce a value. And basically what you're searching for is that additional number that when it all runs through makes an output that's below a certain amount. Right? Does that make sense? I see a little bit of puzzlement. Anyone?
What?
What? Cool. So that last bit underlies the time and difficulty elements of Bitcoin, which I'm going to talk about. Here's a graph. It's a little weird looking. This is a general sort of scheme for creating a chain of custody almost. So if I have something which I'm going to call a transaction or some Bitcoins, and I want to give them to you, how do I do it? So there are two key components. There's this block of stuff, and there's my private key. Let's go back to the public key cryptography stuff. So the way it works is this block is composed of my public key, so everyone sees that, a hash, one of those little numbers, from the previous owner, and a signature of all that data from the previous owner. Don't worry about the previous guy. So imagine this is just a block. So I want to transfer this to someone else. And this picture is owner 2. We'll call it Mike. I want to give Mike some Bitcoins. So Mike has a public key. What I do is I take his public key, I take my old amount of Bitcoins, I take this and I create a hash value from it with his public key. And I take all that and I use my private key to sign it, create a signature. So what it does is now anyone can see my public key, because it's public, that's the idea. And they can use that to check that this transaction was signed by my private key, which means I authorized this transaction, right? And then they can see that the public key in it is Mike's, and so they know it's Mike's the new owner. And then the hash part tells them that it genuinely came from the previous block. Does that make sense? That was a bit of, it's a bit wonky and circular.
All transactions are recorded forever. All transactions are recorded forever.
All transactions are recorded forever, yes.
But where's the proof that you got that?
We're getting to that. This is the first part.
Okay.
So this is not Bitcoin. This is just if I want to have a digital currency that I can transfer ownership of, right?
Why do you need hash? Why do you need hash? What's that hash?
What do I hash?
Yeah.
And here it's a hash of the previous block
Okay. Why do we need that?
to prove that because if I just have a public key and a signature, I don't know what is owned. It's basically it's like a pointer back to the previous block.
So we need a historical data one step back, obviously. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, is that what you?
Yeah, the hash basically allows you to verify the previous step in the transaction. Yep,
Just one step?
just
or-
one step.
Okay.
But then that thing will also have a hash, which will let you go back inductively to the beginning of time.
So you kind of keep on recording every single transaction that this Bitcoin participated in. So you always increase the size of the.
Hmm. And there are some ways around that using Merkle trees. I'm not going to talk about it, but there are ways to trim the blockchain. Large institutions will always want the full one, but if it gets too big, you're on your personal computer, you can run a smaller data set.
What if I open infinite amount of wallets and just keep transferring it, and it will grow bigger and bigger and bigger? What
Mm-hmm. So basically, over a certain number of transactions within a block, which we'll talk about the timing of, there's a required transaction fee. So you'll be losing money.
Okay.
And where does money go for? Where it goes?
It goes to the people processing the payments.
So could newer Bitcoins become more valuable than older Bitcoins, or Bitcoins that have been transacted fewer times?
No, because it's not just the history of. It's not clear from this example, but in Bitcoin, it's not the history of a Bitcoin that grows. It's the history of all Bitcoins that grows as a single entity. And so they all have to have the full chain.
So every Bitcoin transaction involves every other Bitcoin transaction.
Exactly. Cool. So there's limits to this, which we've talked about and I'm sure you've noticed. You can't prevent double spending. If I transfer it to Mike and I transfer it to Vivek at the same time, and they don't talk to each other, then they have no way of knowing that I just cheated them, right? So how do we fix that? There's a kind of obvious way, which is we use someone else as a banker. And so first I send it to them and say, hey, send this to Mike, and they're trusted. So as long as you get money from them or you get certificates from them, you trust them and believe that they're not cheating you. Unfortunately, that's centralized. We want to avoid that. Right? That's the whole point of Bitcoin. So we need some way to resolve this. So the simplest way is if I send the same transaction to two people, who gets the money, right? And we just say the earliest one. First person gets it. Everyone else is, wait until it's verified. Don't just trust it on blind faith. So now we just need some way to order transactions. Because if we can look at the order of transactions, we can say this one happened first, it's real, therefore the other ones are fake. So one way to do that, for example, would be to use Usenet as a time server to publish things to it. And in this diagram, you see items in a block, and then there's a hash. It's all deliciously abstract. But items here would be transactions. So if I make a transaction to someone, they get collected into a block. And these are the things that miners are trying to solve. We're not involving the miners yet, but blocks are what miners are trying to solve. You take a hash of the block, remember that's just making sort of a cryptographic summary of it. And then that hash gets fed into the computation for the next block. And so the value for the hash depends on all of the items in the block plus the hash of the last block, which recursively depends on all the items for that block and all the way back to the beginning of the universe. Right? Does it make sense?
Turtles all the way down.
It is turtles all the way down.
You need a new hash for every new transaction, is that right?
In this case, no. So the transactions here would be the little items. So there's the blocks agglomerate the transactions. A block happens approximately once every 10 minutes, and I'll get into that in a second. But yeah, you basically need a new hash to verify transactions, but you verify them en masse. Make sense? So basically, every 10 minutes, you verify all the transactions that have happened in the last 10 minutes.
But you said that the hash is what the miners are trying to solve, right?
Yeah, and I'll get to how that happens. That's the proof of work thing. It's not in this setup. There's no miners yet, right? This is still a centralized, because now we have a centralized time server or something that computes these hashes and just keeps a log of them. So if you computed these hashes every 10 minutes, posted them to Usenet, and then people could just read like the messages, like you could keep track of which order things happen in, but there's still a centralized component. Make sense?
Does that mean I need to wait 10 minutes when I do the payment to make sure everything is legit?
If you're doubting someone, you need to wait a little more, and I'll explain that. And there was around that too, but I guess.
So the role of the miners is to determine which transactions happen first and to prevent duplicate transactions?
Pretty much. So if you want to have more instantaneous transactions, you would use something like an e-wallet service where you would deposit your Bitcoins, they would clear, and then because they are trusted, someone will accept them. And obviously that's a centralized component, but it's not fundamental to the system. It's a convenience thing. So Bitcoin doesn't claim to be convenient, it just claims to be secure and useful in other ways. So finally, this is where the miners come in. When we're making these blocks, how do we figure out the hashes? And more importantly, how do we get people to agree on what the hashes are? Because if we have more than one person doing this, then we could both come up with different results. And like, who do we trust? This is something that's known in general as the n-generals problem. It's basically a distributed coordination problem. If you have a bunch of people trying to do something and you need most of them to do it at the same time or it fails, and you can't trust them all, how do you coordinate that? It's really hard. And that's actually the core of what Bitcoin does. That's what it actually solves. And so this is how it works. It uses that proof of work algorithm that I talked about, where it's just like you're doing a hash, but you're also adding this little random number after it, and you have to find out which little random number creates a hash that's a hash number that's under a certain ceiling, right? And it's hard to do that. There's no way to predict, like, to go backwards. You can't say, okay, I want a hash of 5. What do I get? Or like, what do I put into it? That's a hard problem that there's no known solution for, right? So basically, what miners do is they take the list of transactions, the block in the last 10 minutes, they add what's called a nonce, this little number, and that they basically guess this over and over again. And every time they do that, they check to see if it meets all the requirements, right? Eventually, someone will find one that does. And when they do, they publish it to the network.
Does every problem have multiple solutions, and it's just a matter of getting sufficiently small?
Yes. And that's I'm about to talk about that, yeah. So basically, that target value, the neat thing about it is the network protocol can actually change what the target is. It's called the difficulty. So as more people try to solve it, it will get solved more quickly because there's more people trying. And so if it gets solved on average more than once every 10 minutes, then the difficulty will go up. If it gets solved less than once every 10 minutes, the difficulty will go down. And so it doesn't actually happen every 10 minutes on cue. It happens approximately every 10 minutes over the lifetime of the system.
But it is a distributed system. How can you control difficulty across all the miners?
So if you have, let's say you have 10 terahashes, 10 trillion guesses per second, right? So, and you understand the key space for the hash. So if you can basically find, if people are guessing 10 trillion times a second, you can find a portion of that key space that statistically they will find an answer to once every 10 minutes. Does that make sense?
Let's get over it.
Okay.
So since mining is kind of a competitive, endeavor, I would assume that there would be an advantage to getting that list of the inputs that they're going to be operating on sooner than other miners. Is that the case? Is there anything that would control that?
That's interesting. Theoretically, there could be, but since it's a distributed system, there's no sort of like mouthpiece for them. There's no spigot to get them from directly. So your best bet would just be to be deeply connected throughout the network, which is advantageous to everyone. So.
So your description made it sound like there would have to be some sort of administrative force, setting out
There is.
the requirement for how difficult.
There is an administrative force. It's the actual Bitcoin client software. So each of these blocks has transactions in it, but it also must conform to specific rules. And the reason it must conform is because if you claim to have solved a block, you send it out to the network, and then other nodes verify your work. And if enough of them sort of believe you, then they start working on the next one. The point is, if you break the rules, then they just don't agree with you, and you don't get the reward, right? So that's how basically the difficulty changes because everybody knows the rules of how it's supposed to change, and they watch for it. And if someone tries to act as if they didn't change, they just ignore them.
So I was thinking of an eventuality in which someone updates their client, changes the rules, and then wins one of the blocks, which influences all future blocks. And so everybody else would have to update their clients to the rules that that person dictated.
Right.
So that...
But the point is, if he's the only person that updated,
right,
then just nobody's going to listen to him.
So when they try to verify, they'll be able to...
When they verify the block, they'll see that he's not playing by the same rules, and this, well, this is not the right game. Go home, right? You're drunk, Bitcoin. Go home.
I think it's like a monopoly, like those brothers trying to corner the silver market a long time ago.
Hunt brothers.
Just eventually, I don't know. There's a pair of two brothers that try. I don't know who brothers.
It's the Hunt brothers.
Hunt brothers, yeah. They're trying to corner the silver market. I think the dynamics of that become something like that, especially as the market gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's more computation. It's like I could maybe see somebody with NSA budgets manufacturing large amounts of ASICs and taking over the Bitcoin market.
Basically, if the government wants to kill you, you have a problem, and that's sort of outside the scope of what maybe. But I do think it'd still be very difficult for them to do so. But it's also how the protocol enables upgrades and bug fixes, because basically if you roll out a bunch of changes and it gets a network penetration, and then once you know that enough people have it, you can be like, okay, let's start using the new rules, guys. And they're like, okay, cool. And then everyone that hasn't upgraded is like, hey, you need to upgrade or else you can't play anymore, right? So it's sort of it's this consensus or near consensus mechanism which sort of defines everything.
So whoever it is who's updating the client has to be in good enough communication with 51% of the network.
Yeah, and the point is it won't happen instantly, right? So you'd want the people working on various clients to sort of agree on the next things they want to do, and then you sort of they each roll them out, and then once enough people adopt them, you can turn it on.
There is more than one client. There are plenty of players involved here that, like BitPay and Coinbase, that would throw their hat in the ring long before anyone else would.
Yeah, but that is one of the sort of known vulnerabilities if someone takes Bitcoin closed source and then becomes super popular with awesome advertising campaigns at the Super Bowl, and so everyone uses their closed source.
GoDaddy Bitcoin.
Yeah, GoDaddy Bitcoin. No, don't sue me, GoDaddy. But if they take a closed source and they put a backdoor in there, and then once everyone's using their client, they turn it on. But it's sort of a really unlikely scenario because nobody with vested interest would want that.
There will always be hash problems be solved as long as Bitcoin's around.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
so if that's the case, but there's only 21 million Bitcoins, what happens when you reach 21 million?
So it has to do with the it has to do with the basically within each block there's a number of free transactions, and then beyond that some level of payment processing compensation is required, and basically I want to send you 10 Bitcoins, and I'm going to throw in 5/10 of a Bitcoin tip.
So that'll always be reserved
or 500s
out of the transactions for
and
the
that'll go to the miners. Yeah. So that's the reason. That's the idea of incentive. There's also some other interesting ideas there. But
Well, there's an opportunity to attach a miner's fee to all of your transactions.
Yeah.
If you're feeling friendly, you can tip your miners, essentially.
yeah, and it also
Yeah, it'll make it
incentivizes
faster.
them to process yours preferentially. So if you put a bounty on your transaction, then miners will be more apt to include that in their next block. One more.
That just threw a monkey wrench into
It sounded like it.
Okay.
Because now it seems that the miners can determine the contents of a block
They can
as an individual.
Sort of, yeah. So basically, there'll be a bunch of transactions. Right now, there's there's only a block's worth or less ever, so they all fit. But if for some reason they didn't, they could choose which ones to try to put in, and then the point is, if they find one of these nonce values that works for these transactions, that's the next block. And then there's still some open transactions that haven't been processed yet, right?
Yeah.
And then, so they'll probably get included in the next block.
And that could have ramifications tied to the block limit that you were talking about.
Yeah.
The 1 megabyte.
And we're I want to wrap this up real quick. We're right at the end. Right at the
Okay,
big round.
good. That's what.
Cool. So difficulty changes, and it's based on this distributed consensus mechanism. So here's the overall operation of view of how the network operates. And all these last 4 or 5 slides are all from the Bitcoin paper that Satoshi published, white paper. New transactions are broadcast nodes. I want to pay my Bitcoins. Each node collects new transactions into a block. Each node works on finding a difficult proof of work for its block. So it takes this block, tries to find the little hash cache value. When a node finds the proof of work, it broadcasts it to everyone. Other nodes accept the block only if all the transactions in it are valid and they're not already spent. So if I say, here's some new transactions, and I'm like, dude, these Bitcoins are already spent, then it rejects my block. Nodes express their acceptance of the block by working on creating the next block in the chain using the hash of the previous block. And the way you basically know if a transaction is actually accepted fully by the network is that the longest blockchain always wins. So basically, if you put a transaction in and it gets accepted and that block gets put in and then another block gets put on top of it and then like block gets put on top of it and you're like 3 ahead of where you started and nobody else is like scooting around, then you're reasonably certain that transaction will be consistent forever. And that part's a little, you have to get into the math a little bit more. It ends up being there's a binary distribution thing going on. But effectively, if someone wants to cheat you and take back your block, they have to end up working faster than the network and actually getting ahead of them. And that's a really, really hard thing to do if you don't control half the network. And I think that's it. So if we have any more questions,
Shall we?
Thank you. Cool. Anyone? Cyprian?
Can you say more details about this script thing which is embedded in the...
So it's I'm trying to remember what it's like. So basically, I can specify on the sender end of a transaction, I can specify basically my public key or the signature and a little script. It's not Turing complete. It doesn't allow you to branch or loop. It does allow you to branch. It doesn't allow you to loop. So you can't actually do some things with it. But on the, I think is it like algol? Sorry, I can't remember exactly. But on the receiver side, I also have a script, and ultimately they need to match up. And so mine will run, and it'll reduce down to a single value it's a stack machine, and then yours will run with this as the input, and if it reduces down to nothing, then we know it's a complete transaction. And getting into the specific, it's basically an abstract stack machine with a limited set of opcodes and built-in cryptographic functions. But getting into it much more than that, probably, I'd have to actually do more research. I don't know how to actually program for it. I do know, for example, that people are currently using that functionality in a parallel chain to provide distributed domain name service functionality. So.
So you said you were working on kind of buying all those Rainbow Lab rigs and
Yeah. Terahashes per second.
Like how many?
4.5 is the estimate right now.
So, like, and are there a lot of people, do you think, going for it? Like,
Mhm.
is it like a mad gold rush?
Yeah, I'm under NDA, but I actually know exactly how many pre-orders they had when we ordered.
Oh, okay.
So.
Yeah, Butterfly Labs has a lot of popularity right
Yeah.
now.
There's-
Devinistic Mining is the other major one that's coming out.
Yeah.
There are companies that are producing these machines, and the anticipation is huge.
I'd say if the network hash rate were under 2 petahashes by the end of the year, I'd be disappointed.
Really?
It's gonna. There's a lot of people getting into it. Yeah.
When do you think you'll make more money off transaction fees than mining rewards?
It's probably
In 100 years.
probably less than that. But yeah, it's gonna be a while. I'll probably say 10 years. Mike, did you have
Oh yeah, I was wondering what do you think the effect of this currency is having on the hardware, on the technology? I know that like video games sort of drove things forward in a way that people didn't necessarily anticipate. What do you think this is going to have?
So I don't know that it's driving currently any really innovative technology. I mean, the ASIC stuff is using basically techniques from the mid '90s. There's some margin for I mean, their process is better, but there's some margin for improvement there. But it's not a very dynamic space right now. It could definitely, hopefully, it will lead to general purpose technology that enables these sort of distributed systems, because Bitcoin's cool and you can piggyback on it, but ultimately I think you want the ability to do other new things. We were talking about voting systems before, right? For like national elections, you could have verifiable, auditable, anonymous one vote per person systems, and that'd be cool. But that's not really a hardware thing. It's more of just what sort of technologies does this open up? A lot, but I don't know what they look like yet. Is there one by here?
Yeah. So, who's delivering the reward? Where does the reward come from?
So, it's effectively. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's I believe you include a transaction to yourself in the blockchain you're computing, or the block you're computing. So, from
It's created by the blockchain.
yeah, it's a special sort of transaction that says from God, from Santa.
Satoshi, we'll call it.
Satoshi, from Satoshi. Because you've been a good little crypto anarchist.
So because this is all essentially, it's like language. It's imagined, and because I and everybody else on the network agree,
it's like all money, right?
Not 25.
Exactly. Yeah. You say, hey guys, here's this number, and Satoshi says I got 25 bitcoins. Everyone's like, praise be to Satoshi, and then it happens, right? Yeah, it's weird because when you get down to it, like I see religions sort of as politics as sort of religions without the God, and economics as spirituality without the woo woo. So it's all just sort of in our heads.
And
but
to a new Bitcoin user, there's a lot of faith involved in transactions.
Yes.
Yeah, you will send your Bitcoins out there and go, oh god, I hope that work.
But
and then you wait 10 minutes and you see everything went through, and then you get your hosting package and you're happy. Or you get your drugs in the mail and you're stoked.
or you're terrified because it's a bad trip.
Yeah, or the cops show up knocking on your door and you know, why did I use my real address?
But ultimately, there's the problem, like any other economic function, right? Why do you pay for anything? Why, money as a means of exchange has value to individuals, just like me, building you a deck has value to you, right? And the value of Bitcoin is that it solves distributed decision making, which is something that has never been possible.
Just an outlandish idea, the whole process of mining bitcoins, are there any other uses for that? For example, solving the hash spaces for brute force hacking, so you have a precompiled. Is it possible?
It's plausible. It's possible. I don't know exactly how you would go about it. I know it's like I said. It's possible that other similar distributed systems for verification of events, effectively, like votes or transfers of property or domain names. I don't know about. I mean, I don't. It depends.
What I'm saying is,
I don't think it would really help you to crack a lot of password hashes.
if you have, a lot of, if most of the hash space is solved, it's going to be a lot easier to hack passwords because you have precompiled sort of.
It might be if you kept a record of all of them. It'd be easier to form collisions if you ended up building an entire catalog of the hash space. But as far as I know, nobody's using the tremendous amounts of disk space required to record all the plain text to create all the hashes.
But I mean, the solved hashes, the bitcoins themselves have.
It's still a very small fraction of the hash space, though. So yeah, you're not going to end up.
Millions, nothing.
Yeah.
Did
you have a question?
Yeah. Did I get this right? The total value right now is 500 million. Is that right?
It changes so rapidly. It's Bitcoins right now. One Bitcoin is worth around $45 to $50.
Okay.
So
there's 10 million left to be awarded. So
yeah.
The mining can generate about $500 million more for somebody.
Assuming that at current values.
Yeah.
So
it's. I'm trying to figure out how big a market you're going after with your.
Yeah, I'm actually going after a slightly larger one because I assuming people continue to adopt Bitcoin.
You're assuming it's going to go up.
Like 21 million of any currency is not very much.
The thought is it'll end up over $100 in a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah, I think if it survives and proves its utility, if you actually have it being used as a major currency instrument, like you're talking about it, a Bitcoin trading at $10,000, $100,000. Again, that's like in 100 years, so that's not the market I'm going after. But I think there's
Satoshi being the smallest unit, that will actually be a spendable amount
yeah,
of money.
it'd be reasonable, and like you'd still have fractions of today's cents in fractional Bitcoins, but I think that the upside appreciation of the currency is the potential significant. Yes.
Got it.
I wonder if we can get to a point when actually verifying a transaction will take more time than anything else.
That's certainly possible, but there are plans to increase the network throughput. Like if we approach the limit of transaction throughput, that's sort of
What is the problem? I mean, throughput of what is the verification? Is it computation?
Well, blocks are currently limited to 1 megabyte in size.
Oh yeah.
So if you just have to lift that restriction.
So you obviously hit the network throughput or whatever.
I mean, it's right now. It's the limitations are only in the rules of the system.
Oh.
Yeah, there's no network throughput. I don't think it's not very network intensive.
So all this distributed effort is enabled by a monetary reward incentive.
Yes.
Would it be, or this is an opinion question,
Hmm?
do you think it's possible for a system like what's used for Bitcoin to be implemented that would enable distributed effort in solving scientific research problems like protein folding or...
Yeah, I mean, there are distributed systems which do that.
But Bitcoin seems to be getting a lot more effort in this.
Well, it's because of the money, right? So if you could pay me to run SETI at home, I'd love to do it. It's but all things being equal, I'd rather spend those cycles on something that I can spend. I love aliens as much as the next guy, but or protein folding, and that's again makes me sound like more of an asshole. So well, cancer's bad, but I want some bitcoins. But yeah, definitely.
So Bitcoin can do it because it's a currency, so it can give imaginary amounts to people.
Mm-hmm.
If it were a language, you could give imaginary extra words to people, or extra spaces for words. If it were research, you could give imaginary extra research.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Well, Bitcoin tickles the parts of your brain which give you dopamine when you find shiny things. Like, wow, I bet somebody will give me a hen for this. Cool. Like it is built into human nature on a fundamental level, right?
I just had an idea. What if it were like giving away equity for an eventual product that comes out of the research?
I mean, we should talk. It just fucking blew my mind. That's that's pretty cool. Yeah, if I could get future patent rights for
Right?
running my,
A percentage of the profits gained by.
it's like, do I do
use of the-
StarCraft 2 or do I retire? I don't know.
But the percentage would be very small because
Yeah.
it would be equal to your percent of that, right?
You'd have to make, the transaction cost would have to be 0, basically, because it's a relatively small fraction of putting out a drug is the computation. And so you'd have
I mean-
a tiny fraction of equity, even if you did a huge amount.
Well, the drug, but protein folding
Yeah.
is a extremely. Oh, it's becoming less. It's becoming more tractable by atomic organizations.
That's cool. Were there some similar currency before, and what happened?
It depends what you mean by similar. Before we keep going, if anyone, like, I feel like some people may be just sitting because we're talking. So if anyone wants to bounce, I'm going to turn around. I won't be offended. And cool.
That's it.
So
Seriously, who wants a beer? Cookies.
I would love a beer, Mike, if you could.